Thank you so much, Merit. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here with you today. And of course, a real joy to be speaking to you about a topic that is so close to my heart and that I'm enjoying the joys and the challenges of every day. Before we start, I also need to quickly announce that I have no relevant financial relationships and will therefore go ahead with the webinar. We have managed to receive CME accreditation for this webinar. So at the very end of the webinar, you will be told what to do and in order to claim those accreditation points. This is now our agenda. So the topic today is the introduction to systematic reviews, but I would love to start telling you first about why systematic reviews are so valuable, and then of course take you through the systematic review process steps from the definition of a question to evaluate, the identification of the body of evidence for it, the selection of the relevant studies, the evaluation of any included studies, and then synthesizing that into a meaningful summary. We'll also talk briefly about the evaluation of the body of evidence and any resource requirements for conducting a systematic review before we then go into a Q&A session towards the end. So let's get started. And I would ask Merit, if possible, to kick us off with a little poll about everyone's profile. So there are several questions here. The first one is about how familiar you are with systematic reviews. So indicate, whether you've ever heard of them, maybe know the basics, but nothing deeper. You have a working knowledge of it, or indeed you would consider yourself an expert. So that's the first one. Then also in terms of, are you a student, a librarian, a researcher, systematic reviewer, or indeed some other role? And then if you have a particular domain or specialty today, that would also be really useful for me to know, because then I can just touch on the relevant disciplines as I go through. That's great. We're about halfway through, everyone. So please cast your votes so that we capture your voice as well. Okay. That's great. I think, Merit, we can close the poll. I don't think there's much change now in these. And of course, I would love to call out to the expert among us. So I hope, you can maybe at the very end also share your knowledge. Great to know that there's, 2/3 of everybody already know the basics. And then some of them even have working knowledge, so have maybe tipped their toes into the water of systematic reviewing. So that's great to know. I see that there are a couple for whom this is a totally new area. I hope that it will still be useful to you, maybe more around the general steps, the general value, and then hopefully that will also whet your appetite to hear more. In terms of your role, okay, we have lots of students, we have lots of researchers as well, which is fantastic to know, and I'll tell you why in a second. Great to have librarians here. They are such an important part of systematic reviewing, so special kudos to you all, and even free systematic reviewers. So brilliant, lovely to have you all, and mostly people are here from medicine and health sciences. Okay, some from social sciences as well. Excellent. So, thank you for all that. So now I have Merit. Could participants also see the results, or is that was that not possible?
Yes, I could see the results.
Okay, great. That's fantastic. So let's get started. First of all, scientific knowledge is cumulative. What does that mean? It means that you never do research or speak about science and scientific knowledge in a vacuum. It's always building on the work of other people and taking those into consideration in order to make the next step. So this is what is meant by cumulative, and therefore evidence should also be accumulated scientifically. So even this part of the steps should be done in a systematic and transparent manner. So what is research or evidence synthesis? These are formal methods for summarizing evidence for a particular question by collecting and summarizing and evaluating studies that address the same question or a similar question, and then look at how the results may vary, or whether they might be consistent in the direction and size of effect. This is very much also the cornerstone of evidence-based medicine. Just a quick reminder here, many of you, in particular those who are working in the medical field, will be familiar with the concept of evidence-based medicine, introduced here in the BMJ back in 1996 by David Sackett and his colleagues. Okay, let me just stop my laptop from rebooting. He defined evidence-based medicine, and you will all know this quote: the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. And the practice of it means, however, to integrate individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research, and also integrate that with patient values and expectations. So it's very much, as you can see, that overlap of these three cycles here, or circles: best external evidence. So evidence is a huge part of it, but it is only one component. It always needs to be in conjunction with individual clinical expertise and, of course, the patient's values and expectations in order to become a meaningful tool for decision making. Evidence-based medicine and research synthesis are very much now, expected behavior in healthcare, in health policy making as well. But it's also important that systematic reviews or systematic evidence synthesis are not only used downstream, so by summarizing studies in order to inform decision-making at the point of care, or in terms of what services should be introduced or expanded, or indeed, policy making, but that it should also be very much informing future research. And this is really, really close to my heart, this concept of the evidence-based research, because it addresses a huge problem nowadays around research waste in the production and reporting of trials, because trials are really needed that address questions that are truly valuable to the research community, and then further down, of course, by users of research. This was very much defined as evidence-based research by my lovely colleague Karen Robinson at Johns Hopkins University back in 2009 in her thesis. And based on that, we then developed further and further this evidence-based research concept. This means that evidence in terms of a systematic review should inform research so that it always addresses questions that matter. And it means that they are valid, efficient, and accessible. Take a look at this initial BMJ publication about evidence-based research that was published back in 2016 to really explain, again, this combination of the systematic review of earlier similar studies, the capabilities, values, and preferences of the researcher, which very much come into play when you plan new research, the opportunities given by the context, so, what is really needed in the local context in terms of research, what is funded, and so on. And then finally, the perspectives, values, and preferences of the patient, or indeed the users, any users of research. So let's take a quick look at how that plays out now. There are many funding institutions now that require you to actually propose as part of your application a review of the existing evidence. For example, the National Institute for Health Research will only fund primary research where such research is informed by a current review of the existing evidence. Where such a systematic review already exists, that should be used, and otherwise it needs to be conducted. Similarly, you can see here the National Institutes of Health. Again, it means that the prior research being cited should also be done in a rigorous manner. And applicants will be expected to describe the strengths and weaknesses in the rigor of prior research. So as you can see, systematic reviews will really help you, not only in terms of decision-making, in particular as part of the evidence-based medicine and shared decision-making with patients, but also will help you as researchers to ensure that your research matters later on. So it addresses a real need, it addresses a knowledge gap, and also it addresses the need of users. So it's both necessary and relevant. Is that already happening today? Unfortunately not. And there's quite a lot of research about research, so meta-research, about this problem. Here you can see a wonderful way to present systematic review results as a cumulative meta-analysis. And I don't know whether you've ever come across this way, but it lists all the relevant studies in chronological order. So you can see the earliest study about this particular question, which looks at the use of a protein in cardiac surgery. So in order to stop surgical bleeding. The first study was done back at the end of '87, and then you can see how many additional studies were done each year. So and so many have recruited patients, and as you can see, this cumulative meta-analysis then adds in any new study. It conducts a meta-analysis each time a new study is conducted, and thereby slowly reduces the width of the confidence interval, which is this line that surrounds the dots, which the dots indicating the actual estimate of effect. And as you can see, this estimate of effect, moved quite a bit in the beginning, but then stabilized. And then from then on was more or less in the same place, which means that it's sort of within the same line. And any additional studies that came later only reduced, the uncertainty around this by smaller and smaller confidence intervals. what it now means that there was a systematic review that was conducted back in 92, around mid-1992, and that showed that, this particular drug was really, really effective. But what happened then? You can see that 52 additional trials with over 5,600 patients were conducted without much or any additional benefit. So there is a huge problem that systematic reviews that have been conducted and have shown, for example, a strong and definitive effect are not utilized in order to inform, or rather prevent in this case, unnecessary new research. Another example here by Haber and colleagues about the use of lidocaine before propofol. Again, the same picture. You can see the systematic review being done in 2000. Before that, 56 studies that were summarized in the systematic review, showing that no further trials are really needed in order to address this particular question. And then after that, however, another 136 new studies were conducted since 2000. Of those, 49 were still relevant. So it's not that after a systematic review, no studies whatsoever should be conducted. Of course, researchers need to still be questioning certain aspects, certain patient populations where the study is still justified, or particular settings, or indeed to check whether study results are generalizable to your particular locality, geography, and so on. But 87 of these studies were completely redundant. What a waste. And of course, it's also interesting to look at this in an international comparison. In this case, Karen Robinson's team, led by Mr. Gia here, looked at clinical trials and the impact of them on patient care from randomized controlled trials conducted in the US versus in China that were looking at statins in patients with coronary artery disease. And you can see again, when was the systematic review done? It was done around 2007. And you can see the number of studies conducted in the US below the middle line. So those studies indicated in this pink. And then those studies conducted in China indicated in the upper half of the image in blue. And it's a very sobering picture indeed, because you can see, in the US, after the systematic review showed that statins in people with coronary artery disease are really, indicated, hardly any additional studies were done, hardly any additional patients were recruited to placebo. But that was not the case in China. And over 2,000 redundant trials were conducted with over 90,000 patients randomized to not receiving the beneficial treatment. And that led to more than 4,000 unnecessary events, including 500 deaths. So it's absolutely important and key to remember that doing any new studies, any new research without really knowing that there is a real knowledge gap. So what the new study will be necessary, in particular if it concerns people or animals, is unethical, unscientific, and wasteful. So how should it be done? Of course, it's also an important question. And we at the Evidence-Based Research Network looked at this and came up with this visual representation in terms of a little diagram. And you can see the actual study being here in the middle, conducting the study. We are not talking about that. I mean, that of course has to be done in a very valid and appropriate manner. But what happens beforehand is what we are looking at here. So you can see at the top, you start out with the new question as number one. And then comes that phase where you need to check whether your research question is really necessary and relevant. And for both of those aspects, you should be utilizing or indeed conducting, if none are available, a systematic review of earlier similar studies. So looking at, what does the evidence show? Has a similar study been done already? And if so, what are the research gaps? And then, of course, also to really systematically obtain end users' perspective. So will your study results, will they matter to the users of your research? And then number 3 is then to decide whether, based on the results of your systematic reviews, whether this research question is really justified. If your answer is no, because either there's no real knowledge gap, or indeed the results will not matter to your users, you need to go back to the research question and adjust it. And if this question itself is justified, then of course go to the next step, which is to utilize the systematic review that you have now available in order to inform the design of the new study. So really utilizing all the rich information that comes of how other researchers have thought about this question, what study designs have been done, and maybe really optimize your own study design based on that. And then, of course, after the study is conducted and you have your new results available, it's absolutely important to then place those new study results into the context of the systematic review of the existing evidence base and describe what does your study add to the existing knowledge, implications for practice, and also implications for research. It's also, sobering to see how all these systematic review results, how late they make it into textbooks, into review recommendations, and review recommendations meaning guideline recommendations. As you can see here, thrombolytic therapy, again, incredibly effective, as we have seen, has made it into routine guidelines and textbooks only very, very late in the day, far later than necessary. Just to add here, what are clinical guidelines, because some of you may not be familiar with it, but they are very much users of systematic reviews because they aim to base statements, for example, recommendations for or against the use of particular interventions in this context of existing systematic reviews of the evidence. Of course, taking into account additional aspects, so-called contextual factors, such as patient values and preferences, equity in a particular local context, feasibility, applicability of the research, and of course, cost, resource information and cost effectiveness information. So again, an incredibly important use of systematic reviews through the guideline recommendations. Now, just a little reminder to add any questions you might have into the Q&A box, and Merit at the end will capture all those and post them to me, and hopefully we'll get all your questions answered. Now we start with the second part of our webinar, which is the systematic review process. We've shown now how important it is to conduct systematic reviews, both to inform new research, to place new research results into the context of the known evidence, and then also, of course, to inform decision-making through guidelines or indeed through the use of evidence-based medicine. Just to add here that systematic reviews, of course, are not only absolutely linked to medicine or clinical research areas, course, systematic reviews are just as important in many other areas, in scientific areas, social science areas, and so on. It's the most of the research, in particular meta-research, has been done in the medical, in the clinical areas, just because this seems to be the most advanced in terms of the literature's databases that are available in order to store and then search for evidence, and also in terms of the interest and the methodology development that has happened in this area has all come out of user groups related to medicine. So there's the most of the known evidence, therefore, and this is why my examples were all taken from clinical science. But I mentioned earlier the evidence-based research network, which promotes the use of systematic reviews in order to inform new research. And that is not just limited to clinical research at all. There are many people part of the network already that come from many different scientific disciplines. And I think it's incredibly important also that as many scientists as possible from other disciplines join that in order to make sure that the use of systematic reviews becomes wider known, wider used, and really leads to something that constitutes valuable research. So let's look first of all to differentiate between different terms that might come up and you might have already heard. One is the notion of a narrative review compared to a systematic review, and then finally a meta-analysis. So you can see here that the largest of these circles represents narrative reviews. So this is a huge amount of literature that has been carried together. They all indicate, that they want to summarize evidence, and they want to summarize that in a narrative, in a qualitative manner. So really just indicating what evidence they have identified, and then bringing the results together in some meaningful way. I'm trying to find the right way to phrase it, because you really need to ask yourself what the value is of such narrative reviews that do not use systematic and transparent methodologies, which characterize the systematic reviews. And I think the sooner we move away from pure narrative reviews to a very distinctly described way of conducting reviews in order to have systematic reviews, the better, because narrative reviews that are not systematic reviews run the risk of really just being cherry-picking evidence that you have either come across more or less by chance, or indeed have a certain bias why you are selecting. So systematic reviews are really there in order to showcase what are your methodologies and how have you applied them in order to minimize the bias of bringing together the evidence. Now, meta-analyses are, again, a subset of systematic reviews. A meta-analysis uses, as it says here, statistical methods to quantitatively summarize results of similar but separate studies. So it means that you have identified studies that are so similar that their results can be brought together through statistical means in order to then be expressed as a shared or a combined effect size. So the step from systematic reviews to meta-analysis, again, has to be very, very thought through. It needs to be done in a correct manner, and I'll come back to this point at the very end of our talk, because not all systematic reviews can be turned or utilize meta-analysis. So what is the systematic review process? So how can you be systematic and transparent in order to then move away from the purely narrative reviews to a systematic review? You always have to start out with defining a question. So what is it that you want to evaluate? Then you move on to identifying the body of evidence that talks about that particular question. You select among the identified evidence those studies that really are relevant. You evaluate them for their quality and other aspects. You synthesize them, so you summarize them in some way. And then you write it all up in a report. Into your protocol, you would describe the methods used in order to conduct your systematic review. Ideally, this process is like a beautiful staircase, one step after the other. But the reality is, and many of you who have already, conducted systematic reviews or indeed have led them know that this is usually more what it looks like. It's not that straightforward, and there are little loops back and redoings and revisiting, and some of it maybe maybe unnecessary in some cases, maybe based on errors done, but in many cases it also means that there are loops built in to improve the outcome of your systematic review. And of course, how do you define your question? Again, not an easy task. You need to be sure that it can be answered. So it should be a question for which a scientific answer can be found. There should be something where there is an probability that there is evidence out there, and that where the uncertainty is not too large. The question needs to be clear and specific in order to then lead to what we call the very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria of the studies. This is absolutely a key step, and it cannot be overestimated how important it is to get this right. This is at the start of the process, and everything else is driven off this. So it's definitely worth spending time to get this particular aspect right. So what does it mean to get a question right? So for example, here is a beautiful review question. What is the best strategy to prevent smoking in young people? It sounds okay, doesn't it? It talks about an intervention, so it's a strategy. It speaks about the population, in this case, young people, and it also talks about the outcome. So these would be strategies in order to prevent smoking. So we are, edging towards a really great review question. But is that really the case? In order for it to be a well-defined question that can be then translated into a systematic review question, it needs to become what we call a well-formulated question. So this is what it looks like. You need to follow the so-called PICO acronym here, with patient, intervention, comparison, and outcome. And as you can see, you need to then look really carefully what is meant by young people. That varies widely between different countries, and also the population. So who are you including? Are these already people who are smoking, who are non-smokers? How often do they smoke, and so on? What should be the intervention? A strategy is not a very precise description of an intervention. So are you looking at media interventions, educational interventions, cost effectiveness? Is there a comparison? Is it that people who are not using a strategy, or indeed comparing different strategies? And then again, the outcome, how would you measure those? Is it self-reported outcomes? Is it process outcomes? Is it objective measurements, using labs and so on? So this is where the real effort needs to go in order to ensure that you have this well-formulated question. Now, for those, coming from other disciplines, the PICO structure is clearly more meant for a clinical case. There are other acronyms and other sort of approaches to help you with formulating questions in other disciplines and in other areas. And that would be, a webinar for another day altogether. If you are interested in that, we can definitely follow up and point you to some relevant information there. So I've already mentioned the PICO. This is another lovely, showcase of how that can be, utilized. P standing for patient or a problem or a population. So this takes it already to the public health level as well. So who does this question relate to? The I standing for intervention. This can be a therapeutic intervention, but it can be also a diagnostic test, a prognostic factor, or any other issue that you are utilizing. Comparisons, again, we've already talked about placebo, no treatment, usual standard care, or indeed another intervention or another diagnostic test. Outcomes, very important to specify the ones that are really that really matter to not only you as a researcher, but also to patients, for example, who are participating in the study. And then this particular acronym has the S at the end to indicate that you also need to think about what study designs you want to include in your systematic review. So what study designs would have been relevant in terms of the primary research? So is that, if you're looking at diagnostic tests, of course, you need to include diagnostic test studies. If you're looking at a therapeutic intervention, then it's definitely worth considering to go to the higher levels of study type in terms of the randomized controlled trials. But of course, if you're looking at prognostic factors, there are no RCTs or diagnostic studies that talk about that. There you need to look at more cohort studies and observational studies. So it's very much determined by the question what the right or relevant study designs are that you need to include in your systematic review. Of course, always consider the timing of the intervention, the follow-up, the comparison, and of course the outcomes as well. So we have now talked quite a lot about defining the question. So let's move on to identifying the actual evidence. So you want to make sure at this step that when you start your searches of the literature, that you identify all relevant or possibly relevant studies. But that is only one part of the coin, isn't it? Because you also want to make sure that you do not identify as much of the unnecessary studies as possible as well at the same time. So this is the balance between what we call recall or precision and the recall and the precision in order to reduce the number of studies that you have to wade through, in order to reduce the effort that you have to put in when you are finding those studies that are really relevant to your question. The first step, and we've already mentioned that at the beginning, was to develop a protocol where you define from the start your question, but also, what databases you will be looking at, whether you will only conduct digital, literature searches, or support that by hand searching of the literature. How many years of literature will you be looking at? What strategies, ways of tracking the documentation of it all. So everything needs to be documented ahead of time and ideally registered as a systematic review protocol, for example, in the Prospero database. This is really important because it showcases then that that you think ahead of time about your methodology, and that you are not really biased by the results that you receive during the systematic review process, in order to then shape your protocol according to what you found. So this is really that you need to do that ahead of time before you start to at least before you start data extracting and then summarizing the evidence. Very important point here. Don't just look in one database. Conducting a systematic review is really different from running a Google search, for example, and even just by running a search in PubMed or in Embase or indeed in the Cochrane library. A well-conducted systematic review utilizes more than one literature database, because it's very well known that you will not find all relevant studies just in one, unfortunately, at the moment. And therefore really important to make sure that you include 1, 2, sometimes 3, or it depends on your question really, more than just the 3 main ones, which are PubMed, Embase, and the Cochrane library. Depending on your particular question, there may be specialized databases that you might also want to add to your search, such as CINAHL. And then it comes to the actual literature search. I've already indicated, conducting a systematic review search is not like running a Google search. So it's not enough to just type something in and then hope that by doing that you will, identify only the most important studies that need to be summarized. This is an art and a science in itself, and of course our librarians who are here know how difficult it is and how much training it really requires. There are helpers such as the controlled vocabularies that have been introduced and integrated within the databases, such as the mesh headings, or indeed in Embase we have the M-tree vocabulary, and you can also utilize so-called keywords, and these databases also utilize synonyms, and you have to also make sure that you add as many synonyms into your search as possible as well. So of course it all comes down to identifying relevant studies, but not all studies will have called the intervention the same, the population the same, will not have defined keywords that are relevant to their studies that are the same. And therefore, it's really, really important to keep your search as broad, but as possible in terms of the number of synonyms and keywords that are relevant in order to find all those relevant studies. I'm showing a couple of examples here, for example, from the Embase, database. Just to indicate how the M-tree vocabulary works. So it indicates to you these are different levels of very broad terms, and then becoming more and more specific until you, for example, in this case, you arrive at a particular intervention used to prevent dental caries. The same one in the mesh headings. Again, it just showcases how that has been given a very particular code and includes certain entry terms that would lead to these particular Pitt and Fisher sealants, in this case, in mesh. So these are attempts to create hierarchies of terms where you can then, as part of your search, decide to become more specific in your search or indeed go broader in order to ensure that you capture all relevant literature. Very important as well, again, a major difference to how we usually run a search in a search engine, that we use day to day. Both PubMed and Embase and usually all the literature databases have a particular language, or as they call it, a syntax on how they would identify the relevant literature. You can see here some words are have a mesh afterwards, so they would be looking at particular mesh terms with that name, or indeed some others would be looking at title and abstract in order to identify these particular terms. You see the little stars, which means that any ending after that star would be appropriate and would still be captured through your search. So really important to make sure whoever attempts to create a search strategy to be sure to be using all this tooling, or you see here lots of ors. Of course, these Boolean connectors and or not, I really used a lot in order to make sure that that you capture everything that is relevant. All the ors, connecting those synonyms in order to make sure, again, that any way a study might have mentioned a patient type, an intervention type, or indeed an outcome, that all of those are captured in the search and therefore find the relevant studies as part of your hits. Unfortunately, the syntax is different between PubMed and Embase, so that's another lesson there. I think people need to make sure that in future it's easier to translate the two. There are now translation tools between one to the other, so there are helpers in order to make sure you don't have to do it all from scratch and by hand, but it's still interesting that these tiny differences still exist. What is also important is that you want to utilize search filters. So these are now in order to make sure that you reduce the noise as much as possible, reduce the effort, but still keep all the relevant studies within reach. So you can do this by reducing the date. So for example, if a particular drug was only approved or indeed, developed, let's say in 1990, there's no use looking for evidence before that. Whatever you find through your search in previous years will just be noise and will just add to your workload. Similarly, you need to think very clearly, is this something that would only apply to a particular language? It's difficult sometimes to add search filters in terms of the language. It's much better to leave them as broad as possible and not just restrict the language to English only. But of course, it will come down also to what is possible for your team to process. But just to add here that nowadays, automated translation tools are really useful and have evolved very much in terms of, in particular, of course, in the medical and clinical field as well, and have been shown to work really well as an initial translation step to check whether a particular study should be included based on its abstract, for example, or indeed its full text. So these automated translation tools are really useful and can get around the need for introducing language filters. Publication type, a very important search filter, because as we talked earlier, certain study types are relevant to your question. So diagnostic study types, randomized controlled trials, or indeed observational studies. Depending on what you are looking for, you need to set your publication type. And use exclusions as much as possible. If you already know that you are not looking for something, you're not looking at animal studies, you're not particular publication types, for example, case studies, case series, editorials, then use those exclusions in order to really make sure that your search is as precise as possible. This is a full search strategy, so you can see this is not something that is just done within 5 minutes. It really requires effort and expertise. And then it's broken down usually in PubMed into these lines, and each of these lines on the right hand side you can see how each of them, how many search results they will receive just for that particular line. And you, by building up by combining different lines, because you are interested in a particular population and in a particular intervention, for example, or potentially excluding some of them, this is how you then arrive at the very end, at the final number of search hits based on the entire search strategy. Similar picture here for Embase. Again, we can see the line by line number of search results on the right hand side. Once you have run your searches, you will want to export these, and luckily both PubMed and also Embase have export functions, and there's also now a standard format, which is the RIS format, in which citations are exported and then can be imported into other tools that come further down the systematic review process step, where you want to include your search results in the reference manager tool in order to then take them forward towards screening. Before you do that, of course, you need to remember to deduplicate your results. We've already mentioned that you would be using more than just one literature database, PubMed, Embase, Cochrane, CINAHL, or any others. But of course, many of these studies are listed in all of them. So it means that when you have run your PubMed search, you've run your Embase search, you have run your other searches, you merge them into one comprehensive list, and then you run your automatic deduplication software in order to get rid of those duplicates where the same study has been picked up by all the different databases. You then end up at the end of the deduplication with a deduplicated, beautiful, individual study list that can then be taken to the next step. And this step is then the selection of the evidence. So in order to ensure that, again, this step is done in a transparent and systematic manner, as part of your protocol, you would have already defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. The screening of the study results happens at 2 levels. The first go is when you only look at the title and if it's available, the abstract of that particular article. So you really need to make sure that at this step you are fairly fast. So as soon as, looking at your list of inclusion and exclusion criteria that you get rid of those that are irrelevant as quickly as possible, but you're not getting rid of anything that might be relevant, and where you're not necessarily sure whether it's it might be relevant based maybe on the outcomes or other aspects that are not mentioned in the abstract necessarily. So at this stage, you get rid of the noise and retrieve those that might be relevant. And for those, you need to then identify the full text in order to then make that final decision. You are usually by a comprehensive systematic review question, you're looking at large numbers of search hits, and to capture your inclusion and exclusion decisions about each of the studies, it really is advisable to utilize digital tools for this step, because you can do this, of course, you could, for example, print out all the study titles and abstracts, and then on paper make little notes. And that is how it was done in back in the 1990s and 2000s. This is when I initially joined the BMJ back in 2003 and worked on a systematic review product called Clinical Evidence. Some of you might still remember it. This is what we were doing, during systematic reviews. Our information specialists would print out huge batches of search results that all had the inclusion exclusion criteria next to them, and then by hand went through each and reported whether some study should be included or excluded. Now, of course, we are in a much better position. There are many different tools that make your life easier in terms of the screening. For our guideline project that was mentioned at the beginning, that I've been leading over the last 2 and a bit years now, we have been using the free tool Kadima, which I can really vouch for. It's a fantastic tool developed by a German team, and will be free forever. So really great tool that has excellent functionalities, utilizes now also AI, so machine learning, in order to speed up the screening process. But there are many other tools out there. Some of them look a bit fancier or more modern, but more or less the same functionality in all. It's great to see, of course, this proliferation and development and innovation in these tools, but it can be really confusing. I added the link to the systematic review toolbox down there, which is a really great resource to check out any digital tooling that can speed up and make easier the systematic review process steps. So I'm always grateful for my colleagues who put a lot of effort into identifying the tools, evaluating them, indexing them, so that you can really find them very easily in the systematic review toolboxes search. I'm showing you Kadima because this is the one I'm familiar with, and here when you start working with it, you have a list of your topics here under your evidence synthesis list. This list can be searched and filtered, and it's once you have set up your project and you have added to it all your search results, deduplicated them once you've merged them, and then the next step is fantastic. In Kadima, it's called the consistency check, where you define who should be part of your screening team. This can be as many people as you like, but you always define ideally at least 2 people should look at the same study in order to ensure this, double screening, and through that reduce the error rates. And during the consistency check, the Kadima tool randomly selects a set number of questions. You define that. Is it 5? Is it 10? Sometimes more, depending on how difficult the inclusion-exclusion criteria are. And then everybody on the team who will be part of the screening would screen those couple of references. And then you can check what is the consistency between the decisions. And you can see here that some of the questions, in particular that one the first study, everybody was clear, this needs to be excluded. And then in the other ones, however, there were people who were for inclusion, which is the green, ticks. And then some of others were, more conservative and, did not think so. And therefore indicated, with a little cross that this particular study should be excluded. And then at this, once this consistency screening step has been done, you would of course talk to each other and, discuss why did somebody exclude a study, why did another person include it, in order to really talk through what the meaning is of your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because it's incredibly important, of course, that everybody is on the same page and understands them completely, in order to then not to make these errors and mistakes during the screening step. You can see that also on the left-hand side that you can define certain terms in Kadima that are then highlighted in the text in order to make reading easier. So in this case, cesarean, randomized, post-operative were highlighted in the text in order to lead the eye and make those decisions easier. Of course, then once you have done your consistency check, everybody is clear how they should be including and excluding studies. You then carry on with the title abstract screening, and this just showcases you how such a tool looks like. You can see on the right-hand side the title of the study and the abstract, and on the left-hand side you can see the inclusion and potentially exclusion criteria, just as a reminder. And of course that doesn't change, but as you then make a decision, the next study comes up. And what is great about Kadima, and it sets it apart a bit from other tools, is that the allocation of your next study that you will be screening is done by the tool. So you don't need to define ahead of time, for example, divide it up, 200 for you, 200 for me. The tool does it automatically. It makes sure that every study is looked by at least 2 people, and that you are always presented with any new study that is still outstanding for screening. So it's a really clever way of getting through it. And then of course there's a dashboard where you can check the progress, and also where you then can upload your full text in order to then carry on towards that full text step. Here you can see that all of the studies that have been included at title abstract screening are listed below. And if you click the button here, show references without full text, only those will be shown where you don't yet have identified full text and uploaded them to Kadima, and then you can easily upload those individually. But it's a really great way to then also go into the full text screening, utilizing the tool again, having the screening criteria there in addition to the full text. These are the steps to upload the full text, and then at the end of it, you can create what is called the Prisma flow diagram. So this shows you really in this algorithmic way the way of the search, how it, how many hits did you receive at the very beginning, from which electronic databases. In this case, you see that 3 databases were searched, PubMed, Embase, and CINAHL, and how many search hits were brought in from each. In this case, in this systematic review, an additional 139 studies were found through hand searching of reference lists, for example. The number of the retrieved studies was over 20,000. This seems to be a rather large systematic review. Most clinical questions don't give you this many hits because it's really scary number. Of these, you have already excluded 2,400 as duplicates, so that's great. That's an easy loss, but you still have over 19,000, for title and abstract screening, and that takes quite a long time because you can just screen so many in an hour, and you have to do all this twice because it's double screening. And as you can see, from the initial retrieved over 20,000, you then wriggle down through title abstract screening to just over 1,400 full texts that are then again, mostly excluded, and only 279 studies are left to be then included for further assessment and data extraction. As I say, this is a huge systematic review. Most systematic review will not have that many initial hits. They will not have that many title abstract screening and full text screening, and also not that many studies included at the end for further processing. But I just wanted to showcase you this as an example for a Prisma flow diagram. This diagram needs to then go into your systematic review publication, of course, in order to showcase the flow of the studies and how you arrive from your literature search to the number of studies that you are including for your analysis. So we have now reached the step where we are looking finally at included studies. So you have done your full text screening, and you have identified a number of studies based on their reports that are relevant to your clinical question. Researchers, and in particular evidence-based medicine researchers, meta-researchers, just seem to love pyramids for whatever reason. And one of the key pyramids, of course, is the pyramid of bias. So important to remember that not all studies are made equal, and you want to make sure that you stick to those study types that are least biased for your systematic review. But of course, that again depends on your study question. But it is acknowledged that the smallest level of bias are at the top of the pyramid, randomized control trials, whereas if you walk down this pyramid to cohort studies, case control studies, then further down to case reports, case series, non-systematic observations, and then finally to expert opinion, that the risk of bias is larger and larger and larger. And that's an important point when you start evaluating your evidence, just to make sure that you understand that it doesn't mean that these studies are necessarily bad. They might be, for example, very relevant cohort studies when you are looking at prognostic questions, for example, but that they carry with them a higher risk of bias than if you had been looking at intervention studies utilizing randomized controlled trials, or RCTs as they are abbreviated. So, as you have identified your study results, you now want to assess the risk of bias of these individual studies. So each of the studies that you have included undergoes now really close scrutiny. And there are different tools, and it also depends, of course, on what your question is. So for randomized controlled trials, for example, the Cochrane collaboration have developed their risk of bias tool. And you can see the components here. The randomization, concealment, blinding, missing data, and reporting, selection, and other bias are captured here. And each of these elements is given a high risk, unclear, or low risk rating. And depending on that, you would then determine the overall risk of bias for that particular study. Observational studies, again, very important in many areas, including social sciences, but in many other science areas as well. There's, for example, the Newcastle Ottawa tool for observational studies that look at particularly the cohort, how representative the cohort is, the selection of non-exposed cohort, the exposure, the outcomes present at the start of the study, comparability and verification of the outcomes, long enough follow-ups, and adequacy of the follow-up. So there are additional details that are captured in order to ensure that the best quality observational studies can be summarized, or indeed that you are aware of higher risk of bias and comment on that as you conduct your analysis. Diagnostic studies, of course, have their own tool, the QUADAS-2 tool. They look at the index test, the standard test, the timing of it, and applicability concerns. So whatever your question is, you need to utilize the right risk of bias tool, of course. Okay, now you have looked at the risk of bias, so the quality of your study, and then you now want to look at the results. And this is what the data extraction step is really all about. And again, into your protocol, it would be great to also just outline the template that you are using for data extraction. So to predetermine what aspects of the study would you want to extract from the study, and then to do that into a consistent template in order to really be able then later to compare and then potentially combine results. The first part of the data extraction looks at the actual study characteristics. So which year was it conducted? Who are the authors? What's the title? What's the study type? Is there a link, DOI for it? And then you start looking at things like the study design, the population that included, the treatment, the intervention, comparison, and then what outcomes were reported, and any notes that you want to add at this point. So this is very much the template used by the Epistemonikos Foundation, who have been a wonderful partner in our guideline project these past years. So my huge thanks to that team. And then you would then look, of course, at the results of your study. So you would check what, for each of the outcomes that you have predefined, you remember at the very start of your clinical question, for each of the outcomes, how were they measured, and what are the study's results? It's important to differentiate between different types of outcomes, how they were measured in terms of continuous outcomes, dichotomous outcomes. It all makes a huge difference in terms of what can be then at the end combined through statistical means into a meta-analysis, and in which case are the studies so different in terms of their reporting, in terms of potentially the outcomes they have, assessed, that they cannot be combined into quantitative analysis. I've already mentioned these aspects again. This is where the notion of the meta-analysis comes in. If the study results cannot be pooled, you need to be describing the summarization in a qualitative, in a narrative way. And then, of course, in those cases where study results can be brought together, this is where the statistics comes in, and you're well advised to ask a statistician, or at least somebody with real statistical experience, to help you with this step in order to make sure that your meta-analysis is valid and meaningful. So when you are synthesizing the evidence, the questions you should be asking yourselves are, can you see an effect? Has an effect been found through the study? If it was, which direction does it go? Does it favor the intervention or does it favor the comparison? Then you start looking at the size of the effect. And also, in case of a systematic review where you have several studies, do these study results show in the same direction? So do they all favor the intervention or favor the comparison? Or is there inconsistency between these different studies? And then at the end of it, looking at the strength of the evidence for the effect across the studies. And this is something that we can look at in a bit more detail next, because this is a judgment that is based on the study design, on the risk of bias of the individual studies, and then additional measures of uncertainty. Now, of course, if it's so much bother to conduct a meta-analysis, why would you want to do it? But of course, you would want to bring the results together, because individual studies may not show you a significant effect, but potentially by bringing together additional patient numbers, you are reducing your uncertainty around an effect, and you might actually end up with a significant effect by pooling the results together. So, of course, you have to investigate whether the studies are similar enough to be brought together, and this is what the heterogeneity tests would show you. You examine the size of the difference between the results of the included studies. You look at the possible reasons for the variation, so the differences between the studies, and then you move forward to combine the results quantitatively in order to obtain that single summary results, or it's also called the pooled estimate of effect. Now, how does that look like? Well, we can take a look in a second, but just before we do that, one word of warning. It doesn't, even if all your studies point in the same direction, it may not mean that there is a true effect. So you have to be really, really critical, looking at the risk of bias of these studies. Might there be a particular approach that was taken by all of these studies in order to arrive at a particular finding? Might there be some motivation behind that, through, for example, particular funders that are behind all the studies, or whether you are really dealing with a true effect here. So, even when all the studies point in the same direction, still keep on your critical hat. As you can see, sometimes all of the results might point away from the actual or true effect. So, what are the circumstances in which you can actually conduct a meta-analysis? So when can you pull results? You have to be able to estimate a common effect, and you have to make sure that all of them have addressed the same question. Otherwise, you might end up with very undesirable effects. If your studies are of poor quality, you will receive poor quality results at the end of your systematic review. So even though your systematic review might be done according to the best possible approach, utilizing the best methodologies, done very systematically, transparently, but if the studies themselves are of very poor quality, the actual recommendations that you can make based on the results will remain very vague and uncertain. So it's really, this interplay between systematic reviews, informing research in order to increase the value and meaningfulness of research, and then having high quality research to go into systematic reviews in order to end up with really meaningful outcomes at the end. This is an incredibly important cycle to get right. So how does this meta-analysis look like? And of course, somebody came up with a really clever way of representing that. This is usually presented as a so-called forest plot, whereby you see the names of the studies on the left-hand side that have been pulled together. At the bottom you have indicated the level of the line of no effect that hits 1.0 as risk ratio. And it shows you sort of the range of effects. Clearly very important to use the right scale in order to showcase a meaningful result and a meaningful difference. And then you see the different effects above, in these blue squares, and some of the squares are smaller, and that is a smaller weight of that study as part of the meta-analysis, usually due to a smaller number of patients in that particular study. And then larger ones representing studies that get a larger weight as part of the systematic review meta-analysis. So not all studies are simply taken as the same. There's a weighting happening here. And once you have then combined the results, you would arrive at the estimate of the combined effect. This is the little yellow diamond here at the bottom, below the individual studies' effect sizes. You need to make sure that you add the relevant captions to the forest plot. Very important. You need to indicate, is it a risk ratio? Is it any other, an odds ratio or hazard ratio? So what risks are you presenting? What results are you presenting? Sometimes it might even be absolute effects. And you need to indicate which way is the direction of effect. So which direction do you need to go in order to favor the intervention and or favor the comparison? So this direction of effect needs also be indicated through the captions at the bottom. Very, very important, and sometimes easily missed out, or indeed, show the wrong way around. So something really to look into. Now, the final thing, of course, I wanted to also mention are these lines that go through each of these squares, and then they also have different widths, and these are the so-called 95% confidence intervals. So this is your certainty into that the shown effect represents the true effect. Here another example of a real forest plot. In this case, early light reduction for preventing retinopathy of prematurity in very low birth weight infants. You see on the right-hand side at the bottom, these are the results that would favor the control. And the left-hand side, the more you move to the left-hand side, the studies would favor the treatment. The overall diamond, you see, sits right in the middle, so it sits on the line of no effect. You can see how this is determined very much by this huge Reynolds study with the largest square, with the smallest confidence interval there. The other studies, you know, for example, side birth would favor even control, whereas, you know, Kennedy back in 1997 found an effect that favored treatment. So individual studies might point in different directions, but the meta-analysis will allow you to pull these results and then come up with a combined pooled effect. In this case, of course, it's you know, there is no effect. And even if such a forest plot shows you a significant effect, which means that your confidence interval, so the line that goes through the effect, does not even touch the line of no effect. Even in that case, it doesn't necessarily mean that that effect is clinically meaningful. So it matters to patients. It might only be statistically significant, but not meaningful in the clinical context. For example, if you have a difference of, let's say, 3 points on a 100-point scale in terms of quality of life, it might be a statistically significant effect, but it might mean very little in terms of real quality of life to patients, whether you are at 67 on the scale or 70. You can see here, just to add here, this is where the statistics also comes in. The meta-analysis always looks at, you know, how different the included studies are, and comes up with these markers to showcase the level of heterogeneity. And you can see, I already mentioned the weights given to each study indicated through the size of the square, but also added here in terms of the percentage. And of course, the largest study with the most patients got the largest weight here as well. There is a wonderful review manager RevMan tool developed by the Cochrane collaboration for meta-analysis. This is also what we've been using in our guideline tool, and it helps you through all the steps of conducting a systematic review, Cochrane style, which currently I would say is the gold standard of systematic reviewing. It helps you with managing the protocols, complete your reviews on time, performing the meta-analysis, which is what we have used it for, and also create these forest plots, and also capture the risk of bias assessments, and even helps you with the process of capturing comments between authors and peer reviewers, and then importing the references and analyzing the data. So the whole process, really a great tool to do that. I'm sure if you conduct systematic reviews, you will come across it. A huge community also that can help you with navigating the waters of systematic reviewing and using the tool. Lots of resources also on how to use it. So yeah, just something to definitely recommend. So once you have conducted your analysis, you have brought together the results, but now you need to look at it. What does it mean? What do these results really mean to the users of your systematic review? So just let you quickly read this, which is a wonderful little image indicating the difference between belief and confidence. So one weatherman says, I figure there's a 40% chance of showers and a 10% chance we know what we're talking about, which indicates you need to keep these two aspects really, really separately. So one talks about the magnitude of effect, which is the 40% chance of showers, and the other one talks about the certainty in the evidence. So how certain can you be that you know what you're talking about? And in order to do that, the GRADE working group came together in order to develop a standardized approach to ensuring that you evaluate the certainty of evidence in a transparent and systematic manner. And in their grading, there are 4 different levels. The high, moderate, low, and very low quality means, moving from high, you're very confident that the true effect lies close to the estimate of the effect, to the very low, where you have very little confidence in that. And then, of course, moderate and low are in between, where you have moderately confident or have very limited confidence, and where new studies might easily change that assessment. So the true effect may lie where your effect estimate is, but new studies might throw new light on this. The GRADE approach has been used by many systematic reviewers and guideline developing organizations worldwide, including the WHO. Definitely worth looking at. It's a very useful tool to work systematically through this assessment of the body of evidence that you have identified through your systematic review. Grading cannot be done without a systematic review. So you definitely need to do all the work before in order to arrive at a nice, bunch of studies that you want to now bring together and assess as a whole. And you do that per outcome. So for each of the outcomes, you would conduct such an assessment of the evidence. So first of all, you would check what study designs have been included in this particular question, in this PICO question, and based on that you would have a starting point. So randomized controlled trials start out with a high certainty because they have the lowest risk of bias, whereas observational studies have a bit of a disadvantage. They start out at low quality and low certainty, and then you can, however, either lower the risk of the certainty through aspects such as higher risk of bias, which you have done based on the risk of bias assessment of the individual studies. You could downgrade for inconsistency, where the different studies show in all sorts of different directions. You could downgrade it for indirectness, where your studies have not exactly been looking at populations or interventions or indeed outcomes that are done in, for example, clinical practice, or the true circumstances where this particular question would arise. You can also downgrade for imprecision. This is when you have those very wide confidence intervals and have just absolutely no certainty in the effect size. And then there may be also other aspects such as publication bias, where it's obvious that not all studies have been actually published or indeed indexed in the databases so that they could be found. So all of these aspects might lower the initial high certainty of randomized trials. But you can also raise up observational studies. If there is a large effect or very large effect, there's a dose response, which means that you can see that doubling the dose will also lead to a doubling or a relevant increase in terms of the response. And then also the third one is if you take all plausible confounding and bias together, but you would still, all of these would reduce the effect, but you still find an effect. That is also a reason to increase the certainty of an observational study. So, and then having done all this, lowering or indeed increasing of the initial starting point, you would then arrive at the final level of certainty rating. And this can range again from high, moderate, low to very low. And you never know at the beginning where you will end up. You really need to do all these steps in order to then arrive at this final assessment. And it's sometimes surprising how rather large randomized controlled trial evidence can still result in low quality or low certainty of the effect based on the inherent problems around the risk of bias or potentially indirectness, inconsistency, imprecision, and so on. So, we've already talked earlier about risk of bias, so I didn't want to go into much detail there, but let's just look at each of these components very quickly. The first one of these was the inconsistency. So do the studies yield different estimates in terms of, due to the difference in populations, interventions, outcomes, and so on? Is there an explanation in terms of the differences? You might have different size of effects. You might have no overlap in confidence intervals between studies. So completely, in different parts of your scale. You might have conducted those heterogeneity statistical analysis, and for example, your statistical significance of heterogeneity has a p-value of below 0.05, or your I2 test is large. All of these are indications that there may be heterogeneity at play, which can be a real warning sign in terms of how the combining those results into one might be problematic. So what might be explanations for heterogeneity? Here there may be different subgroups of patients that have different effects, and thereby the overall effect might be influenced. Different interventions might have been used, different dosages, for example, but also the outcomes might have been defined differently in the studies, and potentially the studies themselves were of lower or higher quality. So, if you find heterogeneity, think very clearly what might be the explanations, and that's also a very important aspect to add to the discussion section of the systematic review. Now, indirectness again. So the direct evidence coming from research, but how does it compare to the population that we are providing the answers for? So does it include the intervention in question? Does it compare it to the appropriate alternatives? Does it measure the outcomes in the same way as they would be measured in clinical care, for example? Are they very important, or just some differences in the population? And depending on that, you can either deduct one level or even two levels based on indirectness, whether it's serious indirectness or very serious indirectness. So yeah, some of this grading is still a bit subjective, whether you think this is very important difference or just an important difference or a very large or impossible to determine the difference, that is sort of a continuous scale, isn't it? And where you put your cutoff point. And this is where, different people who are conducting grade might come sometimes up with different outcomes. But overall, at least the grade approach provides you with the way to explicitly document your decisions around it, and thereby increases the accountability and also transparency of these decisions. Let's move on, because we want to have a few minutes at least for some questions, and we are nearly at the end of the webinar. Looking at imprecision, so are the results precise enough? Is the sample size adequate? Is the power of the study strong enough in order to find a difference? Was the number of events adequate? So, for example, when you're looking at mortality, did you find did any of the participants die? If not, it's very difficult to say anything about mortality. And then, of course, also looking at the narrowness of your confidence interval. This is about, the certainty about the magnitude of the effect. What is very important, of course, here is the line of no effect, which in this case is 1, but also where was it? The appreciable benefit or harm. So this is what really matters in terms of benefit or harm. So this is where it comes back to that clinically meaningful results. So, you need to look at what is a no result, but what is also a meaningful result before you determine, is this something that is precise or not precise? Even though none of them, for example, none of these confidence intervals that you can see going through the estimate of effect, that is this yellow little oval, none of them touch the line of no effect, but one of them on the right-hand side crosses the line of meaningful effect or appreciable benefit or harm. And thereby, that means that you may downgrade this for imprecision, even though it doesn't touch your line of no effect. So it's always important to place the results into the context of the meaningful or clinically important results. And then finally, publication bias. This is a bias or an overestimate or indeed underestimate of an effect due to selective publication of studies. It is known that positive trials get published easier, faster, are cited more. Studies that include larger number of patients are also more likely to get published. And negative trials, so trials that show no effect, are usually less commonly published or get slower publication. So you need to still be looking for, can you be certain that whatever published evidence you have found represents all studies that might have been conducted, keeping in mind that those trials that did not find effect, may have less of a chance to make it into the published literature in the first place. So other aspects, of course, are, certain studies that are funded by industry in order to then, showcase the effect of a particular funded intervention. Or indeed, there's also a problem where you conduct a systematic review with only very, very small trials that in themselves, don't don't constitute much of an evidence at all. So one way to assess this is to check whether you find any unpublished studies, the so-called grey literature, and compare the study results between published versus unpublished studies. And then also there are statistical tests such as the flannel plot and other statistical tests for asymmetry, or, you know, to identify a lack of publication and that has led to publication bias. So you can also downgrade if it's very obvious that there is publication bias. So you can downgrade by 1 if you strongly suspect it, or indeed downgrade by 2 if it's very strongly suspected because it's clearly obvious because of the, you know, funding of certain trials, or that you know, only positive trials have ever been published. You know, there are indications that would make it really, really probable. Now, before we go to the very final bit, quick poll, just to check whether you are still awake. What do you think what step in the systematic review process is the most resource intensive? Ooh, everything catching up. Oh, it's a very, very even field now. Let's see which one makes it. Okay, interesting. Okay, shall we stop? We have had a minute. Fantastic. And, you know, again, it shows, you know, the truth is in the team. Indeed, it is the selection of the evidence, the screening, that is by far the longest or the largest effort. And let me show you this. You can see here about 73% of time of this is again a very large systematic review was done on the screening step. Only 3% done at the start to set up the search, clearly done by a very experienced clinical librarian. Another major part, of course, is the data abstraction or data extraction, nearly 20% there, and then the evidence grading and summarization at the end is only 5% again. So, you know, this is why it's really important to utilize those digital tools, in particular for screening, and to make sure that you utilize a really good template for your data extraction, so not to lose too much time. And of course, don't reinvent the wheel. If there's a systematic review out there already, you know, fantastic. If you know, only if it doesn't exist, then of course you need to do your own. But if it exists, then you need to assess it. Is it relevant? Is it of sufficient quality? If not, then you either have to do your own, or indeed, improve your search for potentially relevant systematic reviews. But if it is both relevant and sufficiently high quality, then you can determine how you want to use it, whether you can use its synthesis, whether you want to use its search and then update it, whether you want to use its references and then work from there. But definitely make sure to report your methods and results of how you utilize these systematic reviews. And don't forget to cite, of course, this the source systematic review in your own work. Fantastic sources for systematic reviews, of course, the Cochrane library, but there are also other very good databases. For example, the TRIP database is excellent, in particular for working clinicians who want quick answers. The Epistemonikos tool, fantastic tool that has points from the systematic reviews into the actual included studies, and even can bring together different systematic reviews and showcase how those overlap in terms of the coverage. The Campbell collaboration, I wanted to point out here for the social science participants. This is where you need to go in order to find out more about the methodology conducting systematic reviews in the social sciences. Also, the Joanna Briggs Institute, an excellent resource, but I just wanted to put all these resources on screen to show, there's a lot of already work that has been done, both in terms of the methodology, but also in terms of the search engines that you can utilize in order to identify those existing source systematic reviews so that you don't have to do all the work from scratch yourself. Of course, always be critical, use a systematic review assessment tool similar to the individual studies that we have seen earlier in terms of the risk of bias. Of course, there are also tools to look at the quality assessment of systematic reviews, in particular AMSTAR and ROBIS. And, just a little reminder to utilize systematic reviews, both in terms of evidence-based decision-making, whatever the context, but also, and very importantly, for evidence-based research. So thank you so much. And thank you in particular for staying on for this very long 2 hours.